Chapter 1. There are people who survive things, and then there are people who survive things and wish, every single morning when they open their eyes and find themselves still breathing, that they hadn't. Lee Chandler was the second kind. He just didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about much of anything, if he could help it. He lived in a basement apartment in Quincy. Not the kind of basement apartment that gets described as cozy, the kind that gets described as available. One small window at street level that showed him feet, shoes, boots, the occasional dog moving past on the pavement above, a radiator that made a sound like something dying every time the heat came on. Walls the color of a decision nobody cared enough to revisit. He had a mop, a bucket, a set of tools in a bag by the door. He was a handyman for 4 buildings in the area. He unclogged drains. He fixed what broke. He carried things upstairs for people who couldn't manage alone and set them down without being asked where and left without being asked to stay. He was good at the job because the job didn't require him to be anything. You showed up. You fixed the thing. You left. Nobody needed to know your name beyond recognizing it as the one attached to the person who came when something stopped working. Lee understood stopped working. He understood it the way you only understand something you have lived inside of. For so long it has stopped feeling like a condition and started feeling like a climate. He drank, not the way people drink when they're celebrating or grieving or trying to feel something. The way people drink when they have already felt everything there is to feel and have decided, quietly and without drama, that they would prefer not to do that again. He drank alone at the bar near his building. He didn't talk to the bartender beyond ordering. If someone tried to start a conversation, he would look at them with eyes so flat and so far away that they would find somewhere else to be fairly quickly. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was distance. The kind of distance that isn't measured in space. He was right there on the bar stool, drink in hand, and he was also somewhere else entirely. Somewhere he never quite came back from. The call came on a Tuesday. He was fixing a garbage disposal that had given up some time in the previous decade. His hands were in something he preferred not to think about. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He pulled off one glove, checked the screen. Manchester General Hospital. He looked at that for a moment. Then he answered. His brother Joe was dead, congestive heart failure. They had known it was coming. Joe had known for years, had managed it, had kept going in the stubborn, quietly heroic way that Joe did everything. But knowing something is coming and having it arrive are 2 different kinds of knowledge, and only one of them takes the floor out from under you. Lee stood in the kitchen of the apartment he had been fixing the disposal in and listened to the voice on the phone and said nothing. "Mr. Chandler, are you still there?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm very sorry for your loss. There are some things we'll need to discuss regarding." "I'll come up," he said. He hung up. He stood there for another moment. Then he picked up his glove from the floor, set it on the counter, picked up his tool bag and left. He didn't finish the garbage disposal. It was the first job he had left unfinished in 3 years. The drive to Manchester by the Sea took about an hour. Lee drove it without the radio. He drove it the way he did most things, mechanically, precisely, without any excess of feeling visible on his face. His hands were at the correct positions on the wheel. His eyes were on the road. But somewhere inside him, in the place he had spent 3 years building walls around, bricking up, insulating against, something was shifting, not breaking. It had already broken. There was nothing left to break, just shifting, the way rubble shifts when something new falls on top of it. He hadn't been back to Manchester in 3 years. He had told himself this was practical. His life was in Quincy now. His work was there. There was nothing for him in Manchester anymore. This was true. It was also not the reason. The reason was that Manchester was the place where his life had happened, where he had been, briefly, improbably, a person with things to lose. A house, children, a wife who laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, who left her coffee cups on every surface in the kitchen, who had looked at him on ordinary mornings with the kind of easy, careless love that you don't know is extraordinary until it's gone. Randy. He didn't let himself think her name very often. It arrived anyway, the way things do when you're driving toward a place you've been running from. Randy. He pressed the accelerator slightly. The town appeared ahead of him. Water, boats, the particular gray-blue of a New England winter sky pressing down on everything. Small, specific, inescapably itself. He had grown up here. He had been happy here once he drove into it like a man walking into something cold. Patrick was 16, Joe's son, Lee's nephew. He was sitting in a chair outside the room where Joe's body still was, wearing a hockey jacket, and looking at his phone in the way teenagers look at their phones when they are trying not to feel something, not mindlessly, but with great concentration, like the screen is the only thing standing between them and what they're trying not to feel. He looked up when Lee came down the corridor, and for a moment, just a moment, something in his face moved, not crying. Patrick didn't cry. Lee had never seen him cry, and Lee had been around for enough of Patrick's life to have expected it at least once. There was something going on behind Patrick's eyes that never quite made it to the surface. Something sealed in. Lee recognized it. He recognized it the way you recognize something in a mirror you've been avoiding. "Hey," Patrick said. "Hey," Lee said. They stood there for a moment in the corridor, two people who were not good at this, in a situation that required exactly this. Then Lee sat down in the chair beside him, and they were quiet together. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't warm. It wasn't the kind of silence that heals anything, but it was something. Joe had left a will. Lee found this out the next morning, sitting across from a lawyer whose office smelled like old paper and coffee, in the particular staleness of a room where bad news gets delivered on a regular basis. Joe had been organized about it. Joe had been organized about everything. It was one of the things Lee had loved about his brother. The steadiness of him, the way he moved through the world, like a man who had decided what mattered and wasn't going to be distracted from it. The house, the boat, a small amount of money, and Patrick Lee stared at the lawyer. "He named me guardian," he said, not a question. He had heard the words correctly. "Yes," the lawyer said. "He knew I live in Quincy, he did." Lee stopped. He knew a lot of things that made the idea of him specifically, being responsible for a 16-year-old human being, not just complicated, but something closer to impossible. "There may have been an expectation," the lawyer said carefully, "that you would relocate to Manchester." "I can't come back to Manchester," Lee said. His voice was very flat, very even. The lawyer looked at him. Lee looked back. Outside the window, the harbor, the water, the town that knew everything about him. "I can't," he said again, quieter this time, more honest. Patrick did not take this well. They had the argument in Joe's kitchen, Patrick's kitchen now, technically, with the familiar smell of the house around them, the particular mix of wood and salt air, and something that had always just smelled like Joe. Lee stood at the counter with his arms crossed. Patrick stood in the middle of the room, and they said things to each other that were true, and things that weren't, and things that were somewhere in between. "You can come to Quincy," Lee said. "I'll figure it out." "I don't want to go to Quincy," Patrick said. "My team is here. My friends are here. My whole life is here." "Your whole life?" Lee said, then stopped himself. Patrick looked at him. "What? Nothing. Say it." I said nothing. Patrick's jaw tightened. He had Joe's jaw, Joe's eyes, the particular set of the Chandler face when it was working very hard not to show what was happening underneath. "You can't just," Patrick started. "I know," Lee said. "Then what are you going to do?" Lee looked at the kitchen. The coffee maker Joe had had for 15 years. The calendar on the wall still open to the month. Joe had stopped being able to update it. The boat keys on the hook by the back door. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said in years. He stayed. Not permanently. He told himself not permanently. But he stayed. He slept in Joe's guest room. He drove Patrick to school in Joe's truck. He learned Patrick's schedule, hockey practice, the girlfriend Lee didn't know about, the band Lee also didn't know about, the particular ecosystem of a teenager's life that Joe had been navigating alone, and which Lee was now supposed to navigate with no map and no preparation. He was not good at it. He was not warm. He was not easy. He did not know how to talk to Patrick the way Joe had, with patience and humor, and the willingness to wait as long as it took for the other person to get to what they actually meant. Patrick's version of grief was loud and scattered and full of manic energy. The thing that happens when you have a loss you haven't processed, and a personality that runs from stillness. Lee's version was so quiet it was almost invisible. They were not a good match. They were what they had. The town remembered him. That was the thing about a place you grew up in. You couldn't be anonymous. You couldn't be the person who shows up, fixes the thing, leaves without anyone needing to know your name. People knew his name here. People knew more than his name. He saw it in the way they looked at him, in the grocery store, at the gas station, at the bar where he went in the evenings after Patrick was home. A certain kind of careful, a certain kind of watching, the particular expression of people who know something about you that you would prefer they didn't. Manchester by the Sea was the kind of town where the past didn't stay past. It sat right alongside the present, patient and heavy, waiting to be looked at. Lee didn't look at it. He had spent 3 years not looking at it. He was very practiced, but it was here, in this town, on these streets, in the face of every person who had been here the night of the fire. The memories came at night mostly. He had learned over 3 years to manage them during the day, to keep busy enough, to move fast enough, to fill the hours with enough practical necessity that the mind had no empty space to fill with what it wanted to fill empty space with. But at night, in Joe's guest room, with the smell of the house around him and the sound of the water distantly present through the window, they came, not in order, not kindly, just there, his daughters. Josephine had been 4, Megan had been 2. Harper had been 8 months old, still at the age where everything was a discovery, where the world was endlessly interesting, where she would look at ordinary things, a spoon, a beam of light on the floor. Lee's face, with a concentration that made him feel every time like he was something worth concentrating on. He had held them when they were born and felt, each time, the specific terror and specific joy of being responsible for something so small and so complete. He had read to them. Josephine liked the ones with animals. Megan liked the ones that rhymed, would finish the lines before he got to them, would look at him with enormous satisfaction when she was right. Harper had liked the sound of his voice more than the words. She would stop whatever she was doing and just listen, as if the fact of him speaking was sufficient, as if he was enough, just as he was, without having to be anything more. He had been a father. He had not been a perfect one. He had been impatient sometimes, distracted. He had gone out when he should have stayed home. He stopped. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth in the dark of Joe's guest room and breathed through his nose and waited for it to pass. It didn't pass. It never passed. He had just gotten better at standing in the middle of it. He had been drinking that night. This was the part that lived in him like something with teeth. Not so drunk he couldn't function. Not so drunk anyone would have known. Just enough. Enough that when he had gone downstairs at 2 in the morning to reload the fire in the living room fireplace, he had set the screen improperly. He had gone back to bed. He had fallen asleep. He had woken up to smoke. He had gotten Randy out. He had tried to get back inside. They hadn't let him. 3 fire trucks. 6 men holding him back. He had fought them with everything he had because his daughters were inside. And he was out here, and the distance between those 2 facts was the distance between a life and the end of one. They hadn't let him back in. The house burned. His daughters did not come out. The investigation cleared him. Accidental. No criminal negligence. The fireplace screen, a spark. The particular bad luck of a draft through an old house at the wrong moment. Cleared. Had stood in the police station and heard the word and felt nothing. Because cleared didn't mean his daughters were alive. Cleared didn't mean Randy could look at him. Cleared didn't mean he could look at himself. He stood there in the middle of the room while people moved around him, officers, a detective, someone with a clipboard, and he was present in the way a piece of furniture is present, occupying space, not participating in anything. Then one of the officers set something on the desk beside him, a coffee. Someone had brought him a coffee. He looked at it. He looked at the officer's belt. The gun. It happened before he understood he was doing it. His hand moved. He took it. He had it in his hand, and it was heavier than he expected. And he had it against his own head before anyone in the room had fully processed what was happening. There was shouting. Hands. Many hands, all at once, grabbing his arms, his wrists, pulling the gun away from him, pulling him down, holding him against the floor. He didn't fight. He didn't do anything. He just stopped, like a machine that had been running on something that had now run out. He lay on the floor of the police station and stared at the ceiling, and the hands on his arms and the shouting above him felt very far away, like sounds coming through water, like things happening to someone else in a different room. They hadn't charged him for that either. They had held him, evaluated him, asked him questions in careful voices, put him somewhere quiet with someone whose job was to sit with people in exactly this kind of after. He had answered the questions. He had said the things you had to say. And then eventually they had let him go, because there was nothing to hold him for, because he had not broken any law that anyone could name, because being a man who had just tried to use a police officer's gun to stop existing was not in itself a crime. He walked out of the station into the cold air. He almost wished they had charged him. At least a charge would have been something to push against. Innocence, the legal kind, was just a door that closed and left you on the wrong side of it, with nothing to do but live. And living, the mechanical, involuntary, one breath after another kind, was the only thing left that he was still doing. He had not chosen it. He was simply still doing it. He walked to his car. He sat in it. He looked at his hands, the hands that had reached for the gun, the hands that had failed at the only thing he had ever truly wanted to succeed at in the years since the fire. He sat there until it was dark. Then he drove. Not home. There was no home anymore, just away. And eventually, the driving became Quincy, and Quincy became a basement apartment, and the basement apartment became the life he was going to have now. Small, manageable, survivable, a life built specifically around the absence of anything worth losing. Chapter 2. Joe's body couldn't be buried yet. The ground was frozen. This was a practical fact about New England winters that Lee had grown up knowing and had somehow, in the fog of the last few days, not thought about until the funeral home director explained it to him with the particular gentleness of someone who has explained this to many grieving people and knows it never gets easier to hear. Joe would be kept in a temporary facility until the spring thaw. Lee stood in the parking lot of the funeral home afterward and looked at the sky. It was the color of nothing. That flat white that isn't quite clouds and isn't quite clear, just closed. The kind of sky that offers no information and no comfort. He got back in the truck. He sat there for a moment. Then Patrick opened the passenger door and got in, and they drove back to the house in the particular silence of two people who have just been told something that makes everything feel slightly more unreal than it already did. So Patrick started. Spring, Lee said. Right. They drove. That's weird, Patrick said finally. Yeah, Lee said. It was the most they had agreed on since Lee arrived. Patrick's life was more complicated than Lee had expected. Not the fact of it Lee had known in the abstract, that a 16-year-old boy would have a life. Friends, school, the usual texture of being that age. He had simply not thought about what it would mean to be responsible for that life, to be the person who was supposed to be aware of it and responsive to it and present within it. Joe had managed this. Joe had apparently managed it well. Patrick's teachers spoke of him with warmth, his teammates with the easy loyalty of kids who have been playing together long enough to trust each other's instincts. Joe had built something for this boy, some kind of stable world, and the loss of it was visible in every room of the house, even when Patrick wasn't visibly grieving, which he mostly wasn't. He was, instead, constantly moving. Hockey. The band, two other boys and a girl named Sandy who arrived at the house on a Thursday evening with instruments and the particular chaos of teenage musicians who are mostly having fun and occasionally, accidentally, making something that sounds like music. The girlfriend Sylvie, who was a year older and had the slightly guarded look of someone whose parents had recently divorced and who was therefore watching all adult behavior for additional signs of impending collapse. Lee met all of these people with the flat, careful politeness of someone navigating a foreign country where they don't speak the language. They were mostly fine with him. Patrick watched this with something that might have been amusement and might have been something more complicated. There was a night 2 weeks in when Patrick woke up from something and came downstairs, and Lee was already there, at the kitchen table, with a glass of water he wasn't drinking, and the particular stillness of a man who hasn't slept and has stopped expecting to. Patrick stood in the doorway in a t-shirt and looked at him. You okay? Patrick said. Lee looked up. Yeah, he said, go back to sleep. Patrick didn't move. Were you dreaming? Lee asked, a pause. I don't know, Patrick said. I woke up and I thought. He stopped. I thought he was downstairs, he said. I thought I could hear him. Lee looked at the table. I know, he said. Do you? The question landed quietly, not accusatory, just real. The genuine question of a kid who was trying to figure out whether the man sitting at his dead father's kitchen table at 3 a.m. was someone who actually understood anything about loss or was just saying the words. Lee looked at him. Yeah, he said. I do. Patrick looked back at him for a moment. Then he got a glass of water and sat down at the table. They didn't talk. They sat there in the kitchen of the house where Joe was no longer in the middle of the night with their water glasses and their separate griefs, until Patrick's eyes got heavy and he went back upstairs. Lee stayed at the table until morning. He ran into Randy on a Tuesday. He had known it was going to happen. Manchester was not a large town. The odds of going indefinitely without seeing the woman who had been his wife were not good, and some part of him had been braced for it since the moment he drove back into town, a low-grade tension in his shoulders, a watchfulness in his eyes whenever he rounded a corner or entered a space where she might be. It happened on the street near the harbor. She was with a man he didn't know, and a stroller and a new baby, bundled against the cold. And Lee registered this in the half-second before she saw him. She looked okay. Not untouched, not healed in any simple way, but okay. The kind of okay that takes years of work to build from nothing. And then she saw him. Her face did something complicated and then went still. "Lee," she said. "Randy," he said. The man beside her looked between them with the careful alertness of someone who has been told enough to understand that this moment is significant. "This is my husband," Randy said. "Douglas." "Hi," Lee said. "Hi," Douglas said. There was a pause. The baby in the stroller made a small sound. Lee looked at her. He could see from the pink hat and then looked away. "I heard about Joe," Randy said. "I'm sorry. Thank you," Lee said. Another pause, the kind that has whole lives inside it. "Are you staying?" she asked. "For a while," he said. She nodded. Something moved through her face. "Good," she said. "That's good." And then they moved past each other on the pavement. Two people carrying the same wreckage in different directions, and Lee walked the rest of the way to the truck without looking back. He sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. He had known she would be okay eventually. He had known, in some distant logical way, that life would continue for her, and that continuing was right and necessary. Knowing it and seeing it were two different things. Seeing it was its own kind of grief, not jealousy, not anger, just the specific pain of watching someone you destroyed manage, without you, to become whole. It was the kindest thing she could have done. It was also almost unbearable. The bar fight happened on a Friday. It was not technically a fight. It was Lee hitting someone, and the someone not hitting back, which meant it was more accurately described as an assault. Two men he didn't know had said something. He didn't fully catch it. Some comment about him, about what people said about him, about what he had done. Said it loudly enough to be heard. Laughed. Lee had crossed the bar and hit the first one before he had made a conscious decision to do it. He would have hit the second one too, but there were people between them by then. He sat in the parking lot afterward with his hand throbbing and the cold air on his face. He wasn't angry. That was the thing. He wasn't even particularly upset. He felt nothing except a faint nausea and the distant awareness that he had just made things more complicated. Patrick picked up when he called. "Can you come get me?" Lee said. A pause. "Are you at the bar?" "Yeah." Another pause. "Did you drive there?" "Yeah." "Then why do you need Patrick?" A beat. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Patrick said. He was there in 8. He drove Lee home without asking questions, which was either teenage self-preservation or a kindness beyond his years, and Lee was too tired to determine which. When they got back to the house, Patrick said, "Your hand's swelling up." "I know. You should ice it." "I know." Patrick got him ice without being asked and handed it to him and went upstairs to bed. Lee sat on Joe's couch with the ice on his hand and the lights off, and the quiet of the house pressing in from all sides. This was the same impulse he had recognized in himself his whole life. The need to make the inside feeling into something on the outside. To have a physical reason for the pain. To give the body something it could understand. It had never helped. It had never stopped him either. Chapter 3. He found Joe's boat under a tarp at the marina. He hadn't been looking for it. He had gone down to the waterfront on a Sunday morning with no particular purpose, the way he sometimes moved when he couldn't stay in the house anymore and didn't want to go anywhere specific, just out. The tarp was tied down with the knots Joe had always used, specific knots. Lee recognized them immediately, the way you recognize handwriting. He stood there looking at the tarp for a long time, then he untied one corner. The boat was cold and still, and exactly the way Joe had always kept it, maintained, careful. Nothing broken that hadn't been attended to. Joe had taken Patrick out on this boat every summer since Patrick was old enough to hold a line. He had taught him to read the water, to understand the weather, to be patient with the sea in the way you had to be patient with anything that was larger than you and indifferent to your plans. Lee had been on this boat 100 times. He had been happy on this boat, in the way you're happy when you're young and don't know yet that happiness is something you can lose. He retied the corner. He walked back to the truck. He sat in it and looked at the water. The water didn't look back. It just moved, slow and gray and continuous. The way it always had, the way it would long after everyone standing on the shore was gone. Lee had always found the sea either comforting or unbearable, depending on the day. Today it was just there, existing. The way he was existing, without particular reason, without particular destination, just still going. He tried twice to find somewhere else for Patrick to go. Not because he didn't care about the kid. It was more complicated than that, and simpler. He knew himself. He knew what he was capable of and what he wasn't, and sustained, responsible care for another human being, the kind that required him to be present and stable and emotionally available, was in the category of what he wasn't. He called Joe's ex-wife, Elise. She was Patrick's mother, and she was also, currently, somewhere in Montreal, with a man named Jeffrey, and a life that had nothing to do with Manchester, and that she had constructed with great deliberateness to keep it that way. She was sympathetic on the phone. She was also clear. She couldn't take Patrick. She was sorry. She knew how that sounded. She was sorry. Lee thanked her and hung up. He sat with that for a while. Then he called George Becker, Joe's oldest friend who lived in Gloucester and who had known Patrick since birth. George Becker would have taken Patrick. Lee could hear it in his voice, the willingness, the warmth. But George was 63, and his wife had just started treatment for something serious, and his life was full in ways that had no room for a teenager. "I'm sorry, Lee," George said. "I wish I could." "I know," Lee said. He hung up. He looked at the wall of Joe's kitchen and understood, without wanting to, that there was no one else. Just him, just this. Patrick found out about the daughters on a Wednesday. Lee didn't tell him. Lee had not planned to tell him, had not, in fact, thought about whether Patrick knew or didn't know, because thinking about it would have required him to think about the thing itself, and he had constructed his entire life around not doing that. It was Sandy who told him, the girl from the band. She had looked it up, not maliciously, just with the casual information-seeking of a teenager who had noticed something strange in the way adults behaved around Lee Chandler, and wanted to understand it. Lee came home to find Patrick sitting at the kitchen table, with the particular stillness of someone who has just learned something large. He looked up when Lee came in. Lee looked at his face and knew immediately. He set his keys on the counter. He didn't say anything. "Why didn't you tell me?" Patrick said. "It's not something I talk about," Lee said. "I know," but Patrick stopped. Started again. "You were here when I was little. You used to come up and take me fishing, and I remember you, and I didn't know you had." He couldn't finish the sentence. "3, Lee said, quietly. "I had 3 daughters. Patrick looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said. It was the right thing to say. It was the only thing to say. And coming from Patrick, who was 16, and had just lost his father, and who had said it with the complete absence of anything except genuine feeling, it landed somewhere in Lee that he hadn't expected. He nodded once. He went to the refrigerator. He stood in front of it for a moment without opening it. "Do you want to talk about it?" Patrick said. "No," Lee said. A pause. "Okay," Patrick said. He didn't push. He just sat there, and after a moment Lee opened the refrigerator and looked at the contents and didn't want anything in it and closed it again. "I'm going to go for a walk," Lee said. "Okay," Patrick said. Lee went for a walk. He walked for 2 hours along the waterfront in the dark and the cold and came back to find Patrick asleep on the couch with the television on and something that might have been dinner, a pizza box partially open on the coffee table. Lee turned the TV off. He stood in the dark living room and looked at Patrick's sleeping face and thought about Joe choosing him, specifically him, to do this, and felt something he could not name moving slowly through him. Not warmth, exactly. Something older than warmth. The particular feeling of being needed by someone who has no one else. He had felt it before. He knew, from experience, that it was not enough on its own to save anyone. He also knew, from the same experience, that it was not nothing. The second encounter with Randy was not on the street. It was at the supermarket, in the cereal aisle, And there was no husband, and no baby, and no buffer of any kind. Just her, with a basket, and him, with a basket, and the cereal aisle. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Randy said, "I was going to call you." "You don't have to," Lee said. "I know I don't have to." She looked at him. She had always been able to look at him in a way that other people couldn't directly, without flinching, as if she could see past whatever he was presenting and into whatever was actually happening. It had been one of the things he loved most about her. It was extremely difficult to be on the receiving end of now. "Are you all right?" She said. "I am fine, Lee. I'm managing," he said. "Patrick, the house, that's not what I asked." He looked at her. She looked back. "I'm not fine," he said. "But I'm okay. I'm here." Something moved in her face. "Good," she said, softly. "That matters. That you're here." He didn't know what to say to that. She seemed to understand that he didn't know what to say to that, because she looked at the shelf instead of at him and said, "How is Patrick doing?" "He doesn't cry," Lee said. She nodded slowly. "He's like Joe," she said. "Joe never cried either. He just got very quiet and then he did something. Fixed something. Built something." "Patrick plays music," Lee said. "When it's bad, he plays music instead." Randy looked at him. "That's not the worst way to handle it," she said. "No," Lee agreed. They stood in the cereal aisle for another moment. "Take care of yourself," she said. "While you're taking care of him, I'll try," he said. She nodded once and moved past him, and he stood very still until he heard her basket set down at the end of the aisle and her footsteps fade. Then he stood there for another minute. Then he put cereal in his basket. He had no idea what kind Patrick liked. He stood looking at the options for a long time and eventually chose 2 different kinds and put them both in the basket and went to find the rest of what he needed. It was a small thing. He did it anyway. Chapter 3. She found him. Or he found her. Either way, there she was, Randy, standing on the sidewalk with the baby asleep against her chest. Her face turned slightly away, like she was somewhere else entirely. She turned when she heard his footsteps. She saw him. And then she started crying, not slowly, not carefully, just all at once. Lee stopped. He didn't move closer. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry, I wasn't going to." "It's okay," he said. "No." She shook her head. "No, it's not." She tried to breathe, but it didn't come right. "What I said to you after." Lee's face didn't change. "For the things I said to you," she said, her voice breaking, "I should burn in hell." Silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Lee swallowed. "I know you didn't mean it," he said. "That doesn't matter, I know." She looked at him, desperate now. "You shouldn't be alone," she said. "You shouldn't punish yourself like this." He didn't answer. "You should live, Lee." He shook his head. "I can't." A pause. "I can't beat it," she cried harder at that, trying to hold it in and failing. I needed to tell you that," she said. "I needed you to know." He nodded once. "I know." A small silence settled between them. "I hope you find something," she said. Lee shook his head. "There's nothing there." She hesitated. "We could," she said. "We could get lunch or something. Just talk." He was already stepping back. "I can't." "Please," she said. "I'm sorry." And then he turned. He walked away. Randy stayed where she was, the baby still asleep against her chest, watching him go. Lee didn't look back. Chapter 5. The thaw came in March. Lee had been in Manchester for 4 months by then. He had not planned to stay 4 months. He had planned to stay long enough to sort things out, the house, the will, the practical arrangements, and then to find some other arrangement for Patrick and go back to Quincy and his basement apartment and his manageable, survivable life. He was still sorting things out. Patrick had grown in those 4 months into something Lee had not entirely predicted. Not easier. Patrick was not easier. He was still loud, still scattered, still capable of making decisions that caused Lee to stand in the kitchen with his eyes closed for a moment before responding. He still didn't cry. He still ran from stillness. But he had also become, Lee searched for the word present, more present, in the way that people sometimes become more present when they've had to face something large. When the world has demonstrated its willingness to take things from you without warning, and you have had to decide what to do with that information. Patrick had decided to hold on to what he had. He held on to his team, his music, his friends. Sylvie, who was still there, still slightly guarded, still watching the adults for additional signs of impending collapse, though she watched Lee a little less warily now. which he took to mean something. He held on to Lee. Not dramatically. Patrick didn't do anything dramatically. He held on the way he held on to everything, by just not letting go, by continuing to show up, by making dinner sometimes when Lee forgot, and by asking questions Lee didn't always know how to answer, and by being in the house, a presence that required response. Lee had begun, slowly and against his will, to respond. Joe's funeral was on a Saturday in late March small, the way Joe would have wanted it. People from the town, fishermen, teachers, people who had known him since he was young, who had watched him raise Patrick alone, and had helped where they could in the quiet, practical way of a community that knows grief without always knowing how to talk about it. Patrick stood through it with his jaw set and his eyes dry, and Lee stood beside him, and neither of them said anything to each other for most of the service. At the end, when the people who had spoken, and the things that needed to be said had been said, Patrick turned to Lee and said, "He would have hated this." "Yeah," Lee said. He always said when people have too many flowers at a funeral, it means they feel guilty about something. Lee looked at the flowers. There were quite a lot of flowers. Something happened in his face that was not quite a smile and was not quite not a smile. He wasn't wrong, Lee said. Patrick looked at him, and then Patrick laughed. It was brief and a little broken at the edges, and it stopped quickly, the way laughter does when grief is right next to it. But it was real. The realest sound Lee had heard in months. "No," Patrick said. He was usually right. Usually, Lee agreed. They stood together by Joe's grave in the March cold, the two of them among all the guilty flowers, and were quiet together in a way that was different from the hospital corridor 4 months ago. Not comfortable exactly, but closer to it than Lee had expected to get. The conversation about the future happened on the boat. Patrick had finally gotten it running. 3 weeks of weekends, Lee handing tools and Patrick doing most of the actual work. The two of them communicating mostly in the language of mechanical problems and solutions, which turned out to be a language they both spoke reasonably well. They took it out on the first warm Sunday. The harbor, the open water, the sky doing something that might eventually become spring. Patrick sat in the back with the tiller, and Lee sat forward, and they moved across the water without talking for a while, which was, Lee had learned, one of Patrick's comfortable silences, the ones he sought out rather than fled from. Then Patrick said, "You're going back to Quincy." Not a question. Lee looked at the water. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "I know." "Patrick, it's okay," Patrick said. "I mean, it's not okay, but I get it. I am almost 17. I can. George Becker said his wife is doing better, and there is the team. I can manage here." "You shouldn't have to manage," Lee said. "Everyone has to manage," Patrick said. That's what it is." Lee looked at him. 16 years old in his dead father's boat, on the water where his father had taught him everything he knew about patience and the sea, managing. "I can't be what he was," Lee said. "I know," Patrick said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not built for it. I want to be, but Lee." Patrick looked at him steadily. I know what happened to you. I know what you're carrying. I'm not asking you to be my dad. I am asking you to not disappear." Lee looked at him. "There's a difference," Patrick said, "between being someone's guardian and being someone's person. I don't need you to be my guardian anymore. I need you to be my person, even from Quincy." Even at a distance, Lee was quiet for a long time. The boat moved under them. The water moved under the boat. "I can do that," Lee said. His voice came out very carefully, the way you carry something fragile. "Yeah?" Patrick said. "Yeah," Lee said. "I can do that." Patrick nodded. He adjusted the tiller slightly. The boat changed direction by a few degrees, found a better line. "Okay," Patrick said. "Just that, okay." And they kept moving across the water, the two of them, in the direction of something that wasn't fixed, and wasn't easy, and wasn't anything like what either of them would have chosen. But it was theirs. And for now, just for now, that was enough. Chapter 6. He went back to Quincy in April. The drive took an hour, as it always had. He drove it without the radio, as he always did. His hands were at the correct positions on the wheel, but the drive felt different, not better. He was not going to pretend it felt better, that the weight was lighter or the road was clearer, or that the particular heaviness of being himself had somehow resolved in the 4 months he had spent in Manchester. It hadn't. He was still who he was. He still couldn't sleep some nights. The memories still came when they came, without permission and without mercy. He still drank, though less than he had in Quincy before. Something about being needed, even imperfectly, had made the evenings slightly more bearable. He still couldn't look at certain things, still felt in certain moments, that pull toward nothing, that exhausted desire to simply stop. But he had also, in the last 4 months, done something he had not done in 3 years. He had stayed somewhere. He had stayed and been present and been responsible for someone, badly and imperfectly, and with a great deal of failure along the way. He had sat in kitchens at 3 in the morning. He had driven to hockey games and stood in the cold watching a kid he had barely known become someone he knew. He had answered questions he didn't know the answers to and admitted it, and kept going anyway. He had not been enough. He was also not nothing. That distinction between not enough and not nothing was one he was still learning to hold. It was slippery. It didn't stay where he put it, but he was learning. His apartment was exactly as he had left it. The window showing feet, the radiator, the walls. He put his bag down. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. Then he picked up his phone and called Patrick. It rang twice. "Hey," Patrick said. "Hey," Lee said. "Just got back. How was the drive?" "Fine. You didn't listen to music, did you?" "No. You should listen to music. It helps, does it? It helps me." "You're 17, almost. What does that have to do with anything?" Lee looked at the window. Feet passing. The ordinary world, going on. "Nothing," he said. "How was practice?" "Good. Coach says if we keep the line we might actually make regionals." Yeah, a pause. "You could come up for a game." "If you wanted." Lee said nothing for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I could do that." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." Another pause. He could hear Patrick on the other end doing something, the particular background noise of Patrick in the kitchen, which was different from Patrick in his room, which was different from Patrick anywhere else. "Okay," Patrick said. Good, Lee said. They stayed on the line for a moment without talking. "Lee," Patrick said.
"Yeah, I'm glad you came up."
"When they called." "I'm glad you came." Lee pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. Then he lowered it. "Me too," he said. He went back to work the next day. He had 4 buildings, a list of things that needed fixing, a mop and a bucket and a bag of tools. He went to the first building, the one with the garbage disposal he had left unfinished on the day of the call, and he finished it. It took 40 minutes. He cleaned up after himself. He moved to the next thing on the list. The work was the same as it had always been. Practical, finite. The satisfaction of a problem that had a solution and a solution that could be applied. He was good at this. He had always been good at this, and he thought not for the first time, but for the first time without the thought immediately collapsing under its own weight. That being good at something, even something small, even something that nobody would remember, was not meaningless. It was not enough. Nothing was going to be enough, but it was not nothing. It was not nothing. He fixed the disposal. He moved to the next thing. He kept going. Epilogue. There is a particular quality to the light in Manchester, by the sea, in the late afternoon of an autumn day. It comes low across the water, the way October light does everywhere in New England. But here it hits the harbor and the boats and the old buildings at the edge of the waterfront and turns everything gold and a little gray at the same time, warm and cold together, like something trying to mean more than it does. Lee stood at the edge of the waterfront and looked at the light. He came up once a month, sometimes more. Patrick had made regionals. Lee had been there, standing in the cold in a rink in Gloucester with George Becker, watching a 17-year-old play hockey with the kind of focus that comes from not knowing any other way to be. They had lost. Patrick had taken it the way he took everything, tight, contained, already moving past it before anyone else could. On the drive home, he had said, "Next year." Lee hadn't said anything. He didn't know if he believed it. He didn't think about belief much anymore. Randy was not at the waterfront. He was not looking for her. They saw each other sometimes, briefly, carefully. There were no more conversations like that one. Nothing left that needed to be said, or could be said in a way that would change anything. He thought about her sometimes. He thought about his daughters every day. That hadn't changed. Nothing about that had changed. He had not found a way to live with it. He had not found a way to make sense of it. He had not found anything. The fire was not something that had ended. It was something that remained constant, Finished, but not gone. People talked about moving on like it was a direction, like there was somewhere to go. Lee stood at the water and knew there wasn't. There was just this: showing up, leaving, coming back again. A phone call he would make later to Patrick, a short one, practical, about school, about hockey, about things that could be answered, things that didn't require anything else. He stood there a while. The light shifted. The boats moved slightly with the tide. None of it reached him, not really. He breathed in, he breathed out. It didn't change anything. He stayed a little longer, not because he wanted to, because leaving